All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the December 14th, 2015 Issaquah City Council work session. This evening we have a single item on the agenda, and it is our state legislative agenda. And it has been prepared ahead of time. Everybody had copies of that in our meeting packet. And reviewing it with us this evening is, well, Diane, are you going to participate, or is this all up to Mr. Levy?
I'll only help out Mr. Levy when he really needs help. But I think he can do a great job.
Okay, well, thanks and welcome.
Bob might want to do
Do you want to do an introduction, Bob?
Sure.
Okay, so tonight we're going to be reviewing this and discussing it and referring it back to regular business for adoption a week from this evening.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Honorable Chair. And we have with us tonight Diane Marcotte and Doug Levy, along with Emily Moon, our Deputy City Administrator, to talk about the 2016 State Legislative Agenda. It's the fourth year we've done this now as part of this process where we've brought Doug on board and developed this legislative agenda for final approval by the City Council. This year's legislative agenda, again, like previous years in terms of process, was an interview with all the department directors, the mayors, executive office, in the development of those priorities for the legislative agenda for this upcoming year. And that's put together and introduced to the council for its review using various policies that the City Council has to as a guide to develop that legislative agenda, and then kind of current trends that are occurring in the state and that are important for the city. This is an off year, and Doug will talk a little bit about that, I'm sure, as part of the process. So it's not as full of an agenda as it was last year when we had the legislature in session. I should say 2015, this past year. So with that, and without further ado, introduce Doug Levy, who's our legislative expert and lobbyist.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. I think to just tag on to what Bob said, what I would say for all of you and for council members here and to come in the new year, this is a skinny legislative agenda, and I think it's a skinny legislative agenda in view of the session coming up in 2016. Unlike 2015, where you had several sessions stretching across 7.5 months, there won't be a debate over a transportation package that was done. There won't be a major 2-year capital budget that was enacted, and there won't be at least a major reopening of the operating budget, the 2-year operating budget that was done. So a lot of the debates and the fire and the fury occurred in 2015, and this will be a 60-day session. I think there are significant elections on the horizon, not only the governor's office, other statewide offices, half the Senate, all of the House members. So the one consistent thing I think we've heard as we've sat down with members is there is an absolute commitment to get done in 60 days so members can be on their way. So what does that mean in terms of our agenda? We think the legislature will have a debate over how they deal with the state Supreme Court's contempt order on McCleary, likely a debate over whether they have a formalized plan or something called a framework or something in between to get to the full funding of K through 12. Maybe a decision on whether they fix a state Supreme Court case dealing with charter schools. There's a lot of pressure on the legislature to come back and fix that. Beyond that, there's not a lot of have-to-dos in Olympia. And so that's why you see only a couple of things at our suggestion on the priority list. One of them, frankly, is defensive, and that is if the legislature begins to move a lot of things around on the budget after the passage of Initiative 1366. We thought it was important to have a plank here around protecting the existing state shared revenues, particularly for you all, things like the streamlined sales tax mitigation. And then we know there is going to be an effort by multiple cities and the Association of Washington Cities to fix what's now about a 3-year-old festering problem with part of the liquor revenues that all cities and counties receive, and that is whenever liquor revenues come from what's now a privatized system, there's an excise tax on all the liquor sold. That issue was dealt with in the 2015-17 budget, where the legislature brought cities and counties back to their historical levels of distribution. So that was a good thing. But the thing that hasn't been fixed is what used to be called the liquor profit account under the old state-run system was transitioned into something called the liquor revolving account when voters passed Initiative 1183 in 2011 and set up a privatized liquor sales system. Right after voters passed that and the legislature was still in the throes of the recession and dealing with a very protracted budget debate, they put a cap on the liquor profit or the liquor revolving account revenues as part of a 4-year balanced budget agreement. And that means that in state statute forevermore, there's going to be $49.4 million a year distributed mostly to cities, also some to counties, through this liquor revolving account. What it means for you guys and for most cities around the state is $49.4 million in the first couple of years might sound okay. As the system grows bigger and more retailers and distributors come online and the volume of sales increase, that $49.4 million would just stay static. And so the percentage of the liquor revolving account money will it'll diminish over time significantly, and all of the excess revenue from this privatized system will accrue to the state. So there was an effort that proceeded quite a ways last year, didn't get all the way there, and so there will be another bill likely to try and deal with the liquor profits. It'll be a phased-in approach, but even at a phased-in approach, it'll still have some out-year impacts on the state general fund. And, you know, we're in an era right now where getting into the state general fund in any way can be very difficult. So this is a shout out to trying to fix this problem and being, you know, hand in hand with our colleagues in other cities in the AWC. It will be a heavy lift. Beyond that is, you know, what we've taken to calling our support oppose list, a variety of things where Issaquah won't necessarily be the lead, but for policy purposes, we want to call them out as things we join others in supporting or opposing or what have you. A number of these things dovetail with what you see the Association of Washington Cities rallying around. Some of the other things we've wanted to make sure to put on the list. We've known, for example, that Council wants us to pay a lot of attention to the human trafficking issues, and so we've had that on the list. Body cameras is another one where there'll be a real vigorous debate in the coming session, so we wanted to have a placeholder there. So with that, we were going to keep the presentation short, take questions that you might have, and would commend this to you for adoption, but obviously want to hear if you want to move things around, change things, delete things. It's your agenda, and it's something you want to be comfortable with before you sit down with area legislators.
So are you asking if just the whole packet, I mean, all 4 pages, any item we want to discuss? So I'm sure everybody just has a long list. I'm sorry, Bob?
I was just going to say, the one thing that, Doug, you may want to just touch on a little bit more briefly, since it's a fairly new emerging issue, is the open records, public records issue, because the council in the past have stayed neutral and monitoring the issue, but with some recent requests, the city's still exploring.
Yeah, we've been more in a monitor mode on the Public Records Act and various proposals over the last few years to change that. I think there was a feeling at the staff level that there's now, in some cases, a volume of requests, in some cases, a breadth of requests that almost calls for some action on reforming or updating the PRA. And for those of you who aren't familiar, there's been a request by a gentleman named Tim Clemens and it's been made not just to this city, but throughout King County and now into Pierce County, where it's been a request for all and any records that the jurisdictions have. So the breadth of it is pretty extreme, and so there's a lot more discussion, I think, going into 2016 about whether there are some ways to reform or update the PRA so that the vast majority of people who have requests and should get those requests honored and should be able to transparently watch their government in action are able to get those, but we don't have a few types of requests or volumes of requests that gum up the system. So while we wouldn't be leading that, we do have on our agenda something in the mode of being supportive of efforts on Public Records Act.
So do you have a question about that in particular, or just have some general? Okay, please, Tola.
I have a question about that one in general, or about that one in specific. So it's interesting, the individual is making the records request. It isn't what I would describe as a nuisance request. It's actually somebody who sort of envisions a different way of municipalities sharing their information publicly. And it seems like it calls out for sort of legislation at the federal level as to how they want municipalities and counties and states to make their records available. It seems like a wholly, it's so much larger of a problem than any one municipality can individually handle. But it also seems like, the idea behind it is not, like I said, is not necessarily a nuisance. And I would hope that as we look at efforts to go forward, I think a parallel effort, and I realize this isn't your responsibility, should be made. There should be a conversation with our U.S. representatives and senators about, as we move forward, whether these sorts of constructs as to municipal information should be made available, because I can see an argument about why people would want to have this sort of a construct, but it's certainly that you can't just one day all of a sudden decide that the clerk's department in the city of Issaquah needs to make 120 years worth of data available.
Right. Well said.
Yeah, Doug, so yeah, Dan Tola, you mentioned our federal level representatives. I think this topic has come up before in Olympia, and there hasn't been any action in the recent years, but I know it's been discussed.
Yeah, I would call the action on the Public Records Act in recent years more one-off type bills to deal with specific problems, but the larger issue of requests that to some might seem harassment related, there hasn't been a legislative solution. We did have the legislature in 2015 direct a study of this whole burgeoning area of electronic records requests. That study is ongoing. It's being conducted by the state auditor's office, and that's designed to get some kind of what I would call per unit cost around what is with paper, the legislature defined it as up to 15 cents per hard copy in statute if someone wants to get paper records. As we go forward, the number of electronic records are starting to and will continue to dwarf the old style of requesting hard copy records. So the legislature directed some way of calculating that, and that will not be done before this session. That'll be something that'll be completed into next year.
Okay. Tola, do you have other questions?
Not around this particular item.
Okay,
So
Stacy?
Tola, you mentioned federal level?
It seems like it's a large enough problem that should be addressed at the federal level as opposed to the state level. I don't really know enough about what reserved powers versus not, but it seems like a national discussion rather than something unique to Washington State.
It's probably not unique to Washington State. I'm only asking in case you knew something that I didn't know.
No,
all
it's not
driven-
around.
Yeah, I think it's all driven by state. Each state's own laws about public records and similar to Open Public Meetings Act. I'm just interested. I was just wondering if you had any more information.
No, this wasn't apropos of any particular effort that's out there.
Okay.
There is one particular area I saw, here it is. Under the section on human service, it says human service and housing. I think human services and housing. The tools, both A and particular B is one that we had a presentation on, and I know Doug, what is, what would be the barriers to succeeding with this in Olympia?
The new local option tools that are being talked about.
Yeah.
So I'd say there are 3 to 4 main ones that are in play, and I think you all have heard some of this discussion, at tables like Sound Cities Association. But one is being brought forward, 2 are being brought forward by Seattle. One would be the idea of a new 1% real estate excise tax that could be enacted by localities and devoted solely to affordable housing. Because the realtors in particular have a lot of ownership of what real estate excise taxes look like and how robust they should be, I think that's going to be a tough multi-year type of effort. There's a second Seattle proposal that I think has been shorthanded as the preservation tax credit proposal, but it's in essence the idea of taking the multifamily housing property tax exemption program that exists for new construction and extending it to existing buildings where the exemption could be utilized to help free up dollars in essence for upgrades to existing rundown facilities. And then the third thing is, I think, being pursued by Kirkland, a demolition fee when there's a takedown of housing. And that's been something that's been used in some other states like Illinois, and they plan to bring a bill forward that would mirror a statute in Illinois. And then the last one I think we have listed, we haven't seen any bill language yet, but we know that State Representative Joan McBride wants to run a bill that would provide some kind of incentives for transit-oriented development to spark housing construction in and around transit centers.
So does the REIT 3, does it, obviously somebody has to sponsor that. Is there any?
I suspect we'll see one of the Seattle delegation members sponsor the bill. I haven't seen a bill yet. Seattle has sent around a draft bill on the preservation tax credit concept, but we haven't seen language on the real estate excise tax yet.
Yeah, because I think this is modeled after what their task force did, the mayor's task force on affordable housing. Okay. Tolan?
I don't think SCA PIC has seen that those efforts by Seattle yet. So I will ask. I'll ask if they can consider it for next year.
Yeah, I think it's good that they be aware of them and discuss them among the suburban city officials.
They were discussed among the Arch Board, and that was one of the issues, one of the tools that when Arthur Sullivan came and addressed us. So I think my awareness is Seattle and then the East Side through the Arch Coalition is where the energy behind it is right now. I don't know that it's actually, I haven't heard yet that it's broadened to the remaining 20-some cities in King County.
One other strand of we may see on housing, in particular and affordable housing, is that we may see, particularly in the House Democratic Caucus, some efforts around capital budget funding for additional housing or additional beds. And the legislature in 2015-17 did put about $32 million in to help with local community beds and facilities. So it's interesting, the Association of Washington Cities, for the first time in my memory, has listed this as a critical issue. And it's just something I think we're all seeing more acutely in the last several years, as frankly there have been funding cuts and some of this has devolved down to the local level.
Mary Lou?
Mine's not so much a question for Doug, more an ask of Diane. And that is that Doug usually provides a very good background on the history of the issue. But where I get a little lost on the fiscal piece is that we talk about restoring certain revenues, and I don't understand historically what we had. And if we're supposed to advocate for this agenda, I'd like to get some data that helps me when I'm sitting with a legislator explain what we used to get compared to what we get, compared to what we'd like to get. So some sort of table The one that did have a dollar attached to it was the state shared revenues, the $800,000 in SST. And that's what it poked at me. Okay, well, that one I get. So it's anything fiscal that was we used to get it and it was taken away. What dollar value is that? That would help me out a lot, but not as part of the bill, just as part of extra information.
Well, and I think one of the pieces, particularly with the liquor excise, understanding that lid of 49.4 million, I think that's a very important piece going out into the future, because it really, we're being asked to provide enforcement services that cost increase every year, but our ability to provide for that stays flat.
And so just quantifying that for me would make me better at advocating.
Thank you. Anybody else? Tola?
Not on that issue.
Okay, actually, I do want to piggyback on one of those. So once Olympia has its hooks in some revenue, they're not going to give it up. I mean, so what kind of magic has to happen for either of our issues in the fiscal issues category to succeed?
These are what I call big-time shoe polish issues. There's going to have to be a lot of advocacy around them. The liquor profit one that I describe here is, the bill is being designed so that essentially local revenues would be restored and made whole over a several-year period. So if I were showing you a graph, it would be an effort to try and get back what was over several years instead of a spike kind of arrangement. So I think there are a lot of legislators that understand this. They never felt comfortable about putting a cap on the liquor revolving account money, but it does now go into their general fund. So to your point, whenever the state is doing something that looks like it is rebooking some general fund money somewhere else, that becomes very difficult to get done. When we had the success last session on the liquor excise tax distributions, those had been cut completely in 2012, and they'd been cut in half in 2013-15. So you all may remember that was months of continual advocacy by cities all over the state, by elected officials all over the state, by law enforcement all over the state. So unfortunately, there is no magic formula on this stuff. It would take a lot of continuous advocacy, and even then, certainly there would be no guarantees around this one.
So what is the overall dollar value to Olympia, and what roughly do we know what it would be to us?
The way this particular bill is being structured, in the existing biennium, there would not be an impact to the state. And in what they call their 4-year balanced budget outlook, there'd be about a $7.5 million impact. So the attempt is to slowly repair this issue versus taking a lot of dollars out of the general fund at once. And what I can do, and I think this goes to Mary Lou's question as well, is we can put together we can share with you some charts that show how the bill would stair-step money back to locals and what that looks like in the form of a graph. And just as importantly, I think what you all would get if there were a restored system versus what you get now. I think that was the ask.
Okay, thank you for that, Tola. You had a question in another area.
Sure. What's this topic of vesting laws? I don't remember that. You may have explained that in previous years, but I don't remember it.
Yeah, so, there's been a lot of court decisions around vesting, and, there's when a development proposal comes to the counter, there's an assumption that once it's been sent into a permit process, it is a vested project. I think there's some desire by the development community to have a lengthier period during which to vest projects, and there's been a lot of back and forth between local governments and the development community on that, and there's been an interim task force circulating proposals. I think I've sent a couple more recent ones to City Hall in just the last week or two.
Stacy?
is, so is vesting, does it differ by jurisdiction based on, so I'm wondering if, what's the effort trying to do? Is it trying to get a longer vesting period codified at the state level so that it's more consistent across jurisdictions?
The law is sort of a point in time for under state law, and the effort by Association of Washington Business groups that are interested in overall more latitude for development is to get a longer period of time, a more flexible period of time.
That's already in the state codes, a longer
I think
time?
for cities and counties, you want to have certainty, and you have laws and a series of court decisions. So I think the cities and counties have been reluctant to make major changes to vesting, and that's where there's been some friction.
I'm not sure that answers my question. Do you understand my question, Bob?
I do. But I don't know the answer.
Okay.
The question is really the diversity of, is there a diversity of local laws that they're trying to fix, or are they just putting, pressure on the legislature to, through fiat to just extend it?
I think it's more the latter,
Yeah.
because I think obviously different jurisdictions have different periods of time that it takes them to process permits, but then there's a point in time where you're in the process and you're considered vested. And that's more uniform across the state.
Okay, thanks.
And there is how does something like this, how does it get on our radar? We want to oppose that. You said developers want,
That's one
obviously
of
a
those
longer
that's, I would
period.
call a sort of a spillover issue. There was a bill in the last session that we ran up the flagpole here where I think our staff's feeling was that, the vesting laws have been pretty well ironed out between statute and court decisions, and, there was a feeling that most other local governments share that we shouldn't have these major sea changes. But this isn't one, this is an example of a bill where we're mostly in second and third chair. We'll watch some other jurisdictions. We haven't been in the eye of the storm as far as I know with any court decisions. So this is one where we'd be a couple of steps removed from a lot of the nuances, if you will.
Dola.
Can you explain a little bit about the item regarding emergency management funding for people who don't understand the Byzantine nature of that funding mechanism?
Sure. It's been a declining source of revenue. A lot of it is federal pass-through revenue, and it's a formula that goes through our State Department of Emergency Management. And as more jurisdictions have come online, as more jurisdictions have gotten certified, it's been either a static or slightly decreasing pot of money from the federal government. And so a lot of the statewide or the local emergency managers around the state have been looking for years at where there could be perhaps a new sustainable funding source for emergency management. And so, we've tended to be in the mode that if that could be found, we'd be supportive of it. And Brett has asked us to keep that on our radar.
I thought there was a specific executive branch grant that had been put out, or something having to do with post 9/11 dollars, or something like that that represented a significant chunk of what the state uses to fund state level emergency management.
About 2 years ago, the state proposed some, what we thought were some fairly radical changes to the formula of how they distributed the federal grant money. And they would have kept more of it at the State Department of Emergency Management, and some smaller jurisdictions would have gotten more money. Some jurisdictions the size of Issaquah and larger would have seen less. So there were a lot of food fights back and forth over that, and that one was sort of settled in a way where I think we felt okay about it. But it's still a fight over a static amount of food scraps, if you will.
Okay. Go ahead, Tola.
Can you talk a little bit about the electric vehicle incentives and what that means in practical terms?
I can a very little bit, because this isn't one that I'm extremely knowledgeable about, but this is one that, you know, we heard from David Fujimoto on. So the legislature has wanted to provide some things like sales tax exemptions for electric vehicles, and incentives for those who are helping build electric vehicle charging capacity. I know Senator Mullet has been very engaged in this issue. And I think there were a couple of bills that had a lot of debate last session but didn't pass. So I know that this issue is likely going to come back, but I don't have a ton of details on exactly what the incentives look like. I'd be happy to follow up.
Seems like you could imagine a scenario where there'd be something that would come forward that we'd like, or there'd be a scenario where there would be something that would come forward that we'd have concerns with, right? Like something that would affect local revenues in an effort to do incentives. So I'm having a hard time understanding if this is something that we're aspirational towards or something that we are trying to be, you know, limiting potential risks with.
Yeah. And I can get more information for you all. Again, that's where I say, on some of these, if you all have a discomfort with some of these things, we can make adjustments as we go toward finalizing. But I'll be happy to get you more information.
Thanks.
Have a- So Doug, could tell us a little bit about the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Program. I think I'm familiar with that, but I think this one has got a little bit of press coverage because of the loss of its funding. Am I remembering that correctly, or was it threatened?
You may be thinking about a federal
Federal?
source of funding called the Land and Water Conservation Fund
Okay.
that was shut off and looks like it's going to come back soon. But the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Program is a state program set up a quarter century ago. It was something where two former governors, Evans and Lowry, were in essence, the founders of it. And it takes bonded dollars in the state capital budget and applies them to several categories of recreation, habitat, farmland preservation. So it's been a program that's been the highest level it's been funded at was $100 million back in the 2007-9 biennium. The lowest level, I think, is it dipped down to about $40 million a couple biennia ago. But it's got a cross-section of folks who really supported it as a way to get grant funding for local parks, state parks, water access projects, trails projects, habitat projects. You all have been successful getting money through the WWRP for things like Central Park. The legislature in the last session asked that the WWRP be reviewed and updated. This isn't likely to have a ton of impact on us, but where there's been some friction with the WWRP is about, in some of the categories affecting state agencies, about half the money is set aside for acquisition of properties and about half the money is set aside for development of properties. There have been some Eastern Washington legislators in particular who have worried about more and more properties being acquired, and they have a concern that that's both eating into their tax rolls on their side of the state and requiring upkeep dollars that the state agencies don't necessarily have. So that's one area where the legislature said, look at these things like acquisition versus development. As a practical matter, I'm working on this a lot for a Parks and Recreation client I have, but for cities like Issaquah, there shouldn't be major sea changes recommended to the program. There will be some changes for the local parks category, the grant category, that would tilt a little bit more of the money toward development of existing sites, which I think from our perspective probably is going to be helpful to you all, because you've done a good job of acquiring some of the sites that you want to see developed, and now you have to get the funding in place for the development. So I can go into more minutia, but that gives you just sort of an overview sense. of the
That's actually very helpful. So, this is not a spillover issue that.
No, this is one that was new coming out of 2015. I think our Parks folks wanted to have it on there as to have a platform that says we like what this program has accomplished overall. We want to keep the basic integrity intact and open to some changes and adjustments along the way, but don't make such a level of changes that the basic program starts to fall apart.
Yeah. The last question I wanted to ask about was the tourism promotion. So we no longer have a tourism entity out of Olympia. What do we know about Washington Tourism Alliance? Does anybody, I could do some research, but there's some effort by them, and
so
what's going on?
when the recession hit in the 2007-9 budget was when we really saw a lot of major changes by the legislature after the recession hit. And one of the changes they made is the state had always provided some funding that went to tourism promotion. Even when the state had a program, it was not funded as much as some other states, even in the West, like Oregon and Montana. But the state was always doing something. But when the legislature hit the recession, they yanked all the state money out of tourism promotion. And so there wasn't anything at the state level for just basic promotion of all the assets of Washington as a state. And the Washington Tourism Alliance was founded as mostly a private sector side effort to have something in place to promote Washington. So you can go on their site, you can do, I think it's WTA.org, but they have a board, I want to say it's about 20 members. The port has a seat on it. I'm trying to think if there's any others within the county that you would recognize, but the WTA has been trying to come up with some way to get the state back into at least helping with tourism promotion. And they had a bill last session that would have created about an $8 million tourism promotion program. And they were actually doing it mostly through industry sector assessments. But they would have had it housed at the state level so that you had some way to help the WTA with the overall administration of the program. The bill did not pass. I think our folks saw value in having more funding, more efforts around tourism promotion, and wanted to be supportive of that. And that bill will likely be back in 2016.
Okay, so do we know, is that, I assume that was just general tourism promotion. Is it actually funds to cities for our own efforts, or is it just their programs at the state level? Do we know?
It doesn't fund cities directly for
okay.
tourism promotion efforts, but where you have things that are a tourism draw, I mean, you have things like the hatchery here, like Salmon Days, where the state can help, or the WTA can help with overall tourism promotion if they had more money to promote tourism with. Right now, they're really in a place where they can maintain a website. They can do a few things in connection with Seattle Visitors and Convention Bureau. And so one of the things that suffers when you don't have a more robust program is you probably end up being a little high-centered out of places like Seattle versus outing other parts of the state. So I think that's where our folks saw some value.
Okay, that's all that I have. Anybody have any other questions or comments for Doug? Josh, this is your last work session. I'm sure you have a list of 20 or so. You're just waiting.
There are many things I would love to see on the legislative agenda, but I think my ability to influence those is waning. So, I mean, there are certain issues I think that on a state level probably should be taken up. I know I've talked here at a city level about things like the use of drones, and there needs to be increased legislation, whether it come from a federal or a state level on that. There's a lot we're learning about things like e-cigarettes that needs to be regulated more on a state level that we just can't handle on a local level. But, it's a 60-day session. And these sort of things just are going to require a little more time than just throwing out some good ideas. We've got to get the right stakeholders on board to address those sort of issues. So this is a great legislative agenda for a short session.
Okay, thank you.
And the homework assignment we took away is on this electric vehicle incentive. You want to know more about the guts of what that is and whether that may be good or damaging or somewhere in between. And then I heard the quantifying some of what's at stake for the city on the liquor profits issue.
Paul, can I
Yeah,
ask
this is
And,
all.
and I just want to make clear, I'm not necessarily against having incentives. I just sort of want to understand the magnitude. I mean, I drove a Honda EV1 back when they would rent them out of LAX, and you know, there were like 6 charging stations in the valley, and it was an exciting time. I just want to kind of understand, is this something that we're aspirational towards, so we have opportunities, or is it something that we're trying to make sure that costs aren't you know, what the order of magnitude is on potential costs? Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. So if we have no other questions or comments, I think we should wrap it up. Is there any other, so you've got your notes? Of course, I'm sure you can Diane will probably watch the videotape recording of this and make sure she catches anything that we might have missed.
She probably
But-
won't.
So if this, from a process standpoint,
Yeah.
if this is good, we'll get the additional information, which is like clarification. We'll just come back to the city council for action.
It's scheduled for the 21st.
Okay, yeah, it's a week from today. And let me, one question. Of our current, well, I guess all the positions are up for reelection this year, well, in District 5. I'm not sure about the Senate position in District 41. It is as well?
The 41st District Senate seat and the 5th District Senate seat will be up in
Both-
2016.
both are?
And both, of course, all 4 House seats. So yeah, you
Yeah.
will be a
Okay.
center of activity in the 2016
Right.
elections.
So is any of this, I heard you explain how it kind of came to be. Have we had any conversations with our current elected leaders in Olympia about any of this?
A little bit, but we try and let the initial big conversation come from you all. You know,
Yeah.
we have set up the breakfast with our legislators, and obviously I'll be running around on a daily basis for you, but you know, we like to have our elected officials present the top priorities to our legislators. I don't think these will be a surprise to them at all, let's
Right.
put it that way.
Okay, thank you.
I was going to say, particularly during this period of time, a lot of communities are looking at what emerging issues that they want to bring forward. So this is a period of time where, you know, we're getting emails from Doug going, I'm hearing this on the street, what, you know, this might be an issue. So getting us prepped for the legislative session, because this is when people are drafting and sharing and shopping different issues.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. If there is nothing else for this evening, anybody want to make a speech? Josh? You already did, okay. Okay, thank you, Doug.
Thank you
Thank
all
you,
very
Diane.
much. Good questions.
All right, we are adjourned.
That's right.
Thank you.